Good afternoon or good evening to you, and welcome to our road registration CESA YPF event. And today we're going to be talking about the roadmap to your professional engineering or technologies or technician registration routes. And I'm just going to start. My name is, first of all, Christian. I'm working at Zutari in the water team. And yeah, a few housekeeping rules to start off with. Just note that the event is recorded and mute yourself during the presentation. You can pose your question in the chat room and we will try our best to attend to it after the presentation. And just letting you know that there might be some load shedding happening. So please bear with us as we keep going. And next slide. So as far as the agenda for this evening is concerned, we'll be talking about how to start your ECSA journey. Then we will look into report writing and professional review. Then the third item will be the experience appraisal and how to get into your professional review interview. And the final item will be the policies and the ECSA documentation. And we have wonderful and seasoned speakers that will tell us more about this. So relax and enjoy the presentation. Without any further ado, I'll hand over to Lerato, who is the MC for this evening. Thank you, Lerato.
Thank you, Christian. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming to our annual Road to Registration event. Our first panelist is Stacy Fundiro. Stacey has a master's in engineering from Stellenbosch University, which she obtained in 2018. She is a structural engineer who has recently obtained her registration in the year 2022. Congratulations for that. And her career summary is that she's got 4 years post-graduation experience, and her focus is on structural design with some civil experience. Materials, structural steel, reinforced concrete, concrete surface beds, masonry, timber, fiberglass, both panels and pultrified sections, and has project management experience. You can go ahead, Stacey.
Awesome. Thank you so much for the introduction, Lerato. Okay, so I will be discussing choosing or starting your ECSA journey with you. The first step would be to choose a mentor. You will then familiarize yourself with the ECSA website. We'll then discuss the 5 degrees of responsibility and then just go through the different competency requirements, because you need to understand what these competency requirements are so that you can become registered with ECSA. Next slide, please. Okay, so just a little bit of background for those of you who don't know what ECSA is. ECSA, or the Engineering Council of South Africa, is a statutory body, and it's been established in terms of the Engineering Professions Act. And ECSA's primary role is the regulation of the engineering profession in terms of this act. So what does that mean? What do they regulate? So they regulate engineering programs. This would be your university degrees, the registrations of persons as professionals in the specified categories, which is where we are all striving to achieve towards, and the regulation of the practice of registered persons. So once you become registered, ECSA doesn't forget about you. They still regulate that you are performing to a certain standard. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so the first step to starting your ECSA journey as you start your new job would be to select a mentor. So your mentor should be someone who is familiar with ECSA's registration process, and also someone who has recently become registered. Ideally, someone who has recently become registered, as they will be most familiar with the latest changes to ECSA's process. So I would recommend you choose someone in your organization, but this is not a requirement from ECSA side. Okay, so some of the roles that the mentor will play in your professional registration preparation: they participate in planning your training program. They advise if the work you are doing is aligned with the ECSA requirements, and make sure you're meeting all those competency requirements, which I'll talk about in more detail later. They will expose you to different problems, different areas of problem solving, management, impact assessment, and mitigation, again, at these different competency levels. And then they will tell you when you're ready to apply for registration and help you with this process. And then they provide you with support, not just in your ECSA journey, but in your career. If there's anything else outside of, I want to say, your ECSA journey, they are there to provide you with support, and they are listed with the commitment and undertaking. I do want to say that you don't need to have a mentor or someone registered with or listed against the commitment and undertaking. I worked at a smaller company and they did not have, I want to say, a formal mentor that was registered with commitment and undertaking, and it is possible to still become registered without this formal process behind you. So, I mean, then you look at your seniors and they sort of become your mentors, even though it's not in the formalized way ECSA doesn't require, but recommends. Okay, next slide. Okay, for those of you that don't know, ECSA's website is ecsa.co.za, and I would recommend that you spend quite a bit of time fiddling around on this website, seeing what is on this website. You will find the different registration categories for both candidate or professional, and then engineer, technologist, and technician. There it's broken down. There's the guide to registration and the different types of application and when you should apply, etc. The relevant documents you will need to apply, the application forms, and also templates for your TERs and engineering reports. And there's also guides to the competency standards, and these are also broken down into the different engineering disciplines. Next slide, please. Okay, so now the next thing is to understand the 5 degrees of responsibility. And these are the 5 degrees these are the 5 different levels you will perform at in your journey to becoming registered. And it is important when you do register that you show in your application that you have performed at these 5 different degrees of responsibility. So I'll work through the different degrees of responsibility, but what's important to note is you'll find that they will overlap throughout your career, and for the first 4 degrees, you need to be there for about 6 to 12 months. And then the final one, you need to perform at degree of responsibility E, which is the last one, for about a year before you become registered. Okay, so the first, go back please, I'm not. Okay, the first degree of responsibility is to be exposed. This is when you start your career and you don't take any responsibility, you do very little work, you basically just observing, almost like a fly on the wall. And your mentor explains everything to you. They take you through all the work and, yeah, specifically things you don't get through your university or degree. Then you will be assisting. This is when you start to do tasks, and the supervisor will explain what you need to do, give you feedback, and you have very limited responsibility. Then you're at degree of responsibility C, where you are participating. And here you are responsible for your work, but you also still have supervision. Then you get to contributing, and now you start to give reasoning for the way you want certain things to be done, and you have less and less input from the supervisor. And then finally you are at performing, where you have the same responsibility as a registered person. Okay. Then the other important thing to understand from ECSA is the 11 different competency requirements or outcomes that you need to be able to demonstrate in your application. And you can do this through complex engineering problems or activities. So this is kind of just some of the characteristics that you will find in a complex engineering activity. And you will find when you get to the point of registration that all the work you've been doing up until this point encompasses one or more of these characteristics. For example, it's a complex system or subsystem, and it's something you've never approached before, so it extends beyond your previous experience. It's multidisciplinary. You're working with people from different disciplines. You have teamwork. And then you may have diverse and significant resources. There's new technologies, materials, or equipment that you need to use. And they are activities constrained by time, finance, infrastructure, resources, facilities, laws, standards, and codes. And this, I find, is almost applicable in every engineering problem you deal with. And then the activities have significant risks or consequences. Okay, you can go to the next slide. So the competency requirements, or the 11 outcomes, have been split into 5 categories, and I will work through these categories and just explain the outcomes in a bit more detail. So the first category, or group A, is engineering problem solving, and this is where you require, or you generally apply your theoretical knowledge and practical methods to identify, analyze, and solve. Outcome 1 is design or develop solutions. So this is, for example, a design requirement. And this outcome 1 isn't the solution. This is just coming up with the problem statement. So what is the problem? That is what outcome 1 is. Outcome 2 is the solution to the problem statement that you developed in outcome 1. And sometimes you will need to use, for example, first principles to solve this, or for your solution. Outcome 3, this is comprehend and apply knowledge. This generally refers to specialist, or for example, this would be specialist knowledge, or something that you're not familiar with, that's not in the codes, that you will need to get a specialist involved in. Okay, then group B is managing engineering activities. So this is your technical leadership and interpersonal skills. Outcome 4 is manage part or all of one or more complex engineering activities. And this can be planning, organizing, leading, or controlling a complex engineering activity. Then outcome 5 is communicate clearly with others. And this is not just your peers, this is the stakeholders, clients, contractors, engineers from other disciplines, etc., through any of your engineering activities. Okay, you can go to the next slide. Okay, then group C is risk and impact mitigation. So outcome 6 has got 2, I want to say, parts to it. The first is the social and cultural side of it, and you need to, how do you take into account the culture or the community within where that specific complex engineering problem is? And the second is the environment. How have you considered the environment and the effects that your project will have on the environment through your engineering activities? Outcome 7, this is your health and safety. So you need to meet all legal and regulatory requirements and protect the health and safety of persons. So basically just be familiar with the Occupational Health and Safety Act. Make sure that you're applying it in your engineering capacity, if I can use it that. And then both outcome 6 and outcome 7, the important thing is that they recognize that the protection of society is priority. So not the solution, but how the solution impacts society, and that society is not going to be adversely affected by the solution. Okay, next slide. Okay, then the group D is conduct engineering activities ethically. Outcome 8 is specifically got to do with the code of conduct, or ECSA's code of conduct, which I also recommend you become familiar with. And this is basically making sure that how you behave is compliant with the code, or that you're just an ethical person in the decisions you make. And if you get put in a situation where you have to make a sticky, like a sticky situation, you make the right decision. Outcome 9 is exercise sound judgment through complex engineering activities. This is, so basically you consider a diverse and wide range of risks, and you make a decision based on these risks. There's often significant consequences involved in this, and it shows that you can correctly apply standards and regulations. Then outcome 10 is be responsible for all, or for making decisions, and basically you need to identify the impacts of your decision, including the negative ones, and you need to then take responsibility for your decision. So even if you make the wrong decision, you need to show that you can still take responsibility and rectify it if needed. And then lastly, group E is, and outcome 11, they're essentially basically your initial professional development. So once you become registered, it becomes CPD, which I'm sure everyone is familiar with, but before it's called initial professional development. And basically you continue learning. And so this can be done through courses, and prior to registration, these don't need to be CPD accredited courses, although I do recommend you do some of those, but it's also your practical experience. It's what you're learning in the office, what you're learning from your peers, it's what you're learning on site, etc. And all of this contributes towards this professional development. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Stacey.
You're welcome.
Next up, we've got Pieter Gers. He's got a national diploma, which he obtained from Central University of Technology in 2014. Following that, he obtained his BTech, also at the Central University of Technology in 2015. He also possesses a BSc Honours in Transportation Planning, which he obtained from University of Pretoria in 2019. He possesses his professional engineering technologist, which he obtained in 2020. And his employer's history is SMEC, Royal Housekoning, and Western Cape Government, where he's currently employed. His career summary is that he's got 8 years of experience in the road transportation industry, and his experience includes geometric design, pavement design, borrow pit investigations, contract administration, technical report writing, and routine road maintenance operations. You're up. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks. Just okay. Hi, everybody. So the different topics that I'll be discussing today is the registration categories, the different 3 types that I will be discussing. And then next, I will just also briefly discuss the registration process from start to finish, just a brief summary on that. And then I will also be touching on the training and experience report, or otherwise referred to as the TERs. And I will also touch on I'll also actually more elaborate on the engineering report itself. Yeah, can we just go to the next slide, please? Okay, so ECSA has basically 3 main types of registration categories. Firstly is a professional engineering technician, a technologist, or a professional engineer. This is just a bit of background. For a professional engineering technician, ECSA requires a Dublin Accord qualification. This is usually a national diploma in engineering technology, and ECSA defines this as well-defined engineering problems. So this is more practical with related theory. And the next one is a professional technologist like myself. It's defined as broadly defined engineering problems. This is a bit more theory, but still practical, I would say, if we can put it sum up in that. And this is usually a bachelor's degree in technology, or typically referred to as a BTech degree. And the third category is a professional engineer. ECSA is usually looking for Washington Accord qualification. This is usually a BEng degree or BSc degree in engineering, and is defined as solving complex engineering principles, or it can actually also be referred to as solving complex engineering problems from first principles. So that's just to give you some background of the different types of registration categories. Can we go to the next slide? Okay, so the registration process, just to sum it up briefly, all of us should register as a candidate first. Then that's just normally a form that you fill in, and they verify your qualifications, and you get registered as a candidate. After this, you should have a minimum of 3 years post-qualification experience. What I want to highlight here is that it's not post-graduation, post-candidate experience. You can register as a candidate and immediately register or apply for professional registration as long as you have 3 years post-qualification experience. Just a side note on this, if you have more than 10 years experience post-qualification, the only difference is in your template, you'll use the DEO form, which stands for Training Experience Outline, instead of the DER. That's basically just dotting down your experience in bullet point form. So that's only just a side note. That's the only difference. And after you've completed your application, you submitted the application with all the required evidence and signatures from your mentors and referees, you wait for further correspondence from ECSA, and they will either invite you for appraisal review interview or professional review interview. The next speaker will actually elaborate a bit more into detail regarding this process. But just for a summary, if your report and TER and basically your application is written well enough without any missing outcomes, you will get invited straight to the professional review interview, so which is more actually ideal. But as I said, the next speaker will actually elaborate a bit more on this. Yeah, okay. So we can go to the next slide. Okay. So the training and experience report, or otherwise referred to as the TER, this is an extract of my own TERs. I'm just gonna explain to you the outline and what is more or less expected where. So the very first part is an organogram that you have to include of yourself and all the different parties that was involved in that specific period or that project that you worked on. So you can just dot down, your position, the people, even outside the organization, lateral that you supervised. That's the first part. Then the second part of the first paragraph in this section is the nature of training or of experience. This is a brief summary that you should include of basically who was the client, if I can put an example, what type of project it was, what was your involvement. I think it's like 20 to 30 words is the guidance, but it shouldn't be more than a paragraph. It should be like just be brief. Yes, okay, can we go to the next slide? All right, the part after this is if I can sum it up, it's the nature of, if I can put it that way, that's the engineering part. Nature of problems addressed in this report, method of analysis, developing a solution, and evaluation. So here you should basically take a problem that you identified. How did you came to the solution? How did you solve it? Yeah, the part after this is management of materials, machines, manpower, methods, money, and contracts. Here you should state the type of, I would say, software that you used, or the machines, or the hardware that you used what did you do with it to basically execute your work. Part after that, interactions with clients, stakeholders, and other disciplines. That's actually exactly what it say. You should highlight with what other departments within your organization or outside your organization that you collaborate with, that you basically to achieve your goal, to make the project successful. And the part after that, health and safety considerations, hazards, environmental considerations, and other legislation. Here you should state the other type of considerations, like, for example, environmental, health, safety consideration you actually considered during your project that you during that stage. And then the part just underneath that, you can describe your role and responsibilities. This you can actually dot down in bullet point format, what your responsibilities were, and the block just after that, the degree of responsibilities that Stacey also mentioned previously, actually elaborated on that. What I just want to also add here is that you can't, for example, in your very first TER, tick a level E there, because if coming straight after university, it's not really possible to be performing at a level E. So yes, and yeah, this is just, I would say this, the TERs is not for candidates, it's the easier part of the application, but this is more or less what's expected. And here on the side, the outcomes criteria and criteria that you can only do after you write after you write your engineering report, you can go back and link it to the outcomes. So just note on that. Okay, that's basically just a general view how the TER looks like, but in general, it's not. It's the easier part of the application. I can go to the next part, the next slide. Sorry. Okay, so the engineering report itself, I would say this is the more difficult part of your application. This is where you have to sit a bit and think and choose your words carefully. As previously also you're all aware of the outcomes, Stacey also mentioned it, and all the sub outcomes. What I just want to highlight here is the outcome A, those first three outcomes. Those are like the engineering bit, and I would say it's more important, but I would say it's actually, yeah, I would say basically it's a bit more important. Not that outcome 4 to 11 is not important, but they will test you in a professional review interview mostly on those first three, and most of your questions will come out of those first three. So just be aware of that. Those 1, 2, and 3 is actually the engineering part, if I can put it that way. And another thing that I can just point out is if we for example, look at outcome number 6, like recognize, address, and foresee social, cultural, environmental, and in a broadly defined engineering activities, you shouldn't be like an environmental expert, because we are not environmentalists, we are engineers, but you should at least know the basic principles of it. So, and illustrate that. So if I can give an example, you should know if any, you can't construct anything within 500 meters of a wetland without acquiring a water use license. So you should just know basically those basic principles, or what's the difference between environmental impact assessment and just a basic assessment. So so that's just want to highlight that actually. Can we go to the next slide, or my last slide? Okay, so when you actually start to write your report, I just want to give basically a few guidelines or a few tips how you should approach this. So I would, the very first point is you should write in first person. I think that's very obvious, but I think some people still get that wrong. The next point is, I would say, very important. You should explain what you did. Remember, ECSAs and the panel, they are interested in what were your responsibilities, not the organization responsibilities, because your competence is tested, not your colleagues. So this leads into the next point. Avoid phrases like our team, we, my colleague, and I. So just keep that in the back of your mind. Summarize your experience in each outcome. Remember, your pages is limited, and therefore you shouldn't, you should basically you should dot down the important information without dragging the entire paragraph out. So you shouldn't, for example, say SANRAL appointed us, and SANRAL stands for South African Road Agency Limited. That you already did mostly in your TERs. You should basically go straight to the point. And I just want to highlight that, and use the next point to use the correct technical terms without complicated scenario. So you should use the technical engineering terms in your report, but don't overcomplicate it, the thing that no one understands what you are writing there. Okay, that's the next point. Is basically, I already said that. Be on point. Remember, your maximum pages allowed is 50 pages. If you submit 51 pages, it won't be a problem, but you can't submit 70 pages in total. So just try to keep as close as possible to the guidance that is given. And the last point that I also want to make is be honest about your experience that you obtained. You can lie and basically dot down information that you didn't actually do, but in the professional review interview, they will definitely, I think, catch you out, because then they test your knowledge. So, and that's also against one of the outcomes to be ethical. So that's it. Thanks from my side.
Thank you very much, Pieter. Next up is Gugulethu Mkhabela. She's got a BEng in Civil Engineering from the University of Stellenbosch. She's also obtained a postgraduate diploma in Business Administration from Wits Business School. Gugulethu obtained her ECSA professional registration in the year 2020, where she worked for CSM from the year 2015 to 2021 and is currently at Nierop. Her career summary is that she's got 7 years of experience specializing in the design of underground infrastructure, water, sewer, and stormwater, roads, parking, and building platforms. And her experience also she's also gained experience in project management. Currently, she's working as a senior civil engineer within the buildings, infrastructure, planning, and advisory markets. Thank you, Gugu.
Thanks, Loretta. So, as I have been introduced, my name is Gugu, a senior engineer at Nierop. My task today is just to provide you a bit more insight about the two types of ECSA interviews that the applicants can expect as part of the professional um, registration process. For both these interviews, being the experience appraisal interview and also the professional review interview, I will go through the definition, guide on the interview preparation, talk about the interview structure, and then also just outline the possible interview outcomes that one can expect. So the content of my presentation is all outlined in detail in the ECSA registration interview guide document, which is published on the ECSA website. The first speaker did make mention of the details of this and where you can just browse through the entire page to get more information about the whole registration process. So I too just suggest that you go through this document just to get a more detailed explanation and guidance in terms of the two interviews that you can expect as part of your registration process. So in this diagram, I have outlined basically the interview evaluation process just to get a better understanding of how this whole thing works. So once your application has gone through the administrative check and also the experience appraisal stage, ECSA can notify you that one, your application is incomplete, so they request more information on that basis, but this I will not be touching on in this presentation. Or they can tell you that there are some gaps in your submission and they need clarity on some items that you've submitted, so they would invite you for an experience appraisal interview. Or the third outcome or third communication would be your application has successfully gone through the experience appraisal stage and you are thus invited for a professional review interview. Next slide, please. So we will first look at the experience appraisal interview. And an experience appraisal interview is an interview that is scheduled after the experience appraisal stage, where the assessors have found that inadequate information was submitted to satisfy the majority of the assessors that all outcomes and requirements have been met. This interview is basically centered around the outcomes which the assessors have identified to have gaps and where additional information is required. The specific outcomes are listed when the interview communication is circulated, and these are the outcomes that the applicant must focus on when preparing for the interview. So in the communication that they send you, they will actually go about and list the specific outcomes which they need more convincing on. So they'll say either outcome 1, 2, 6, 7, and these are the ones that you must actually focus on during your preparation. So the objective of this type of interview is to basically gather additional information to satisfy competency against all outcomes. Next slide, please. So now we'll move on to look at how would you actually then go about to prepare for this type of interview once they've notified you that, well, you are invited for an experience appraisal interview. When you receive the email, it is always good and good practice to just acknowledge the email, acknowledge receipt, and confirm your attendance, noting the meeting details in terms of your date and time and place. I think if you cannot make the scheduled time, you do communicate, and then they will provide further guidance or a different slot, which you can then be accommodated on. Once that is done, you then go through what you have submitted, which is your training experience report and your engineering report, specifically focusing on the highlighted outcomes for which additional information is required. During the preparation, it is important to review the requirements of the listed outcomes. So as other speakers have guided, in the documents, they do say what are the requirements for certain items, for certain outcomes rather. So you do then review a report and then just make sure that you have actually displayed all the requirements in your submissions, because the assessors will be specifically probing on these parts of the requirements which they feel are not matched in your submission. This interview also just serves as a good experience for a professional review interview if this whole stage is successful, and then you're then at least better prepared and for the next interview, which could be your professional review interview. Just a general note, they do ask for you to bring some form of identification during your interview, just for the validation process. Next slide, please. At the interview, which will be either in person or online, mostly online during these times of COVID, you can expect 3 professionally registered peer reviewers who will question you on the outcomes for which you're supposed to provide additional information for. I think in the document, they do state that in some instances there may be 2 reviewers, but if you are uncomfortable with this, you can always just bring it up and then they will take it from there. Just a tip, it is always a good idea to use technical terminology and refer to engineering principles and codes during your interview when you're actually just trying to explain yourself when it comes to the outcomes that have been identified as lacking. Next slide, please. So after you've done your interview, what you can expect is the assessors which were present or your reviewers are then expected to internally produce an interview report. This report is moderated before any communication is sent to the applicant, where the outcomes, there are basically 2 outcomes that can come out from this. Either they notify you that the experience appraisal was successful and the applicant can then be invited to a professional review interview. I will be speaking about the professional review interview after this part of the presentation. Or they can notify you that your experience appraisal interview was not successful, which means the application for professional registration was rejected. In this case, reasons will be stated for this rejection and further guidance will be provided. Next slide, please. So the second part of this presentation focuses on the professional review interview. A PR interview is an interview that is scheduled to allow the applicant to prove competency against all 11 outcomes after the assessors have actually concluded that the applicant has indeed shown competency against all outcomes. This interview is centered around all the outcomes, with the objective being to make a final decision about the applicant's qualification to register as a professional engineer. Next slide. When it comes to the preparation of the interview, the same basically applies in terms of just acknowledging the receipt of the email and confirming meeting details. And then also just going through your training experience report and your engineering report, where the only difference here is you just need to be familiar with everything that you've submitted and not just specific outcomes as compared to what you would be doing for the experience appraisal interview. For this interview, you also need to prepare a 15 minutes presentation, which highlights how the outcomes have been achieved through your recent work, where your degree of responsibility was the highest, which is degree E. So it is better to focus your presentation on where you, for the time where you had the greatest degree of responsibility. The presentation should be centered around your complex projects where you are mostly working independently, as you would be expected to once you're a professional engineer. Personally, for me, it made it much easier when I was doing my presentation to just focus on a couple of projects. So not really talk about all the projects which I had noted in my report, but for instance, for Group A, Group B, Group C, I chose one project so as to just manage my time as well, because in doing that, choosing one project, then I was only required to explain or to define or give more information about the project once, and saved some more time just to go through the other outcomes. So for instance, for Group A, for this, so as I said, chose one project, even though in my report I think I had spoken about 3 projects, but chose one key project. I introduced this group by sharing my understanding of what a complex engineering problem is and how one would go about solving this problem. In my presentation, I made sure that I presented what problems I encountered, the solutioning process that I went through, displaying also the equations and the methods and all relevant references in terms of guidelines, bylaws, and any acts which I also considered as part of just the solutioning. So you do have to speak about outcome 1 to outcome 11 and present information that's in your report, even though you might feel the need to further explain yourself. Just be mindful about not presenting entirely new information during your interview process, because this is not the time to just bring them up with new information that they haven't had the time to consider and also process. Next slide, please. So the same as the experience appraisal interview, this was either in person or online, and where there's at least 3 registered peer reviewers that are engaging in that presentation, and thereafter the question and answer session. Once you are done with your presentation, the reviewers will actually ask you specific questions related to the content of your report. For me, when I went through the whole question and answer session, which was after I had presented in that 15 minutes. The first part of my session was very technical, where the interviewers focused on different stormwater management calculation methods and the reasons behind me selecting specific methods for my work. Even though I had not touched on some things in the report, such as the different methods that are possible for different site characteristics. They were actually very interested in that, just so they check that I am aware that should the site conditions or the site characteristics rather change, there are other methods or way of actually going about and doing or producing that stormwater management plan. The second part of my presentation was actually information which was mostly presented in my report. So they questioned about tender administration and adjudication and ethic related questions when it comes to that part of the work. I had to speak about Occupational Health and Safety Act and how that was always considered in my work and in my delivery. And also they did question about the important acts, such as like the NEMA acts and as I previously mentioned, the Occupational Health and Safety Act. Next slide, please. So with this, the outcome can, once they've also just produced an interview report, which is moderated, the outcome can be your professional review interview was successful and the applicant thus qualifies to be registered as a professional engineer, or they notify you that your interview was not successful and then thus you don't qualify to be registered as a professional engineer. For this rejection, they will also just provide reasons and then further guide you in terms of what to do from then forward. This brings me to the end of my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Gugulethu. Next up, we had scheduled to have Mr. Erik Kidlin, who has a BSc in Mechanical Engineering and a Master's in Industrial Administration. He is professionally registered and supports and assesses ECSA's candidates and serves as a mechanical engineering interviewer on the ECSA panel. As far as his career summary is concerned, his areas of expertise are energy efficiency, solar water heating, water reticulation rates, fire safety, and air quality. Mr. Kidlin has acted as the mechanical engineering coordinator at numerous engineering and efficiency CPUT conferences. He's also an editor of a series of water and building material handbooks. His hobbies include motorcycling, off-road driving, and volunteering as a hiking guide. Unfortunately, Mr. Kidlin is experiencing some technical difficulties with his mic, but should one of our attendees request to get in touch with him to ask a few questions as far as the ECSA process is concerned, especially as a mechanical engineer, please let us know and we'll provide you with his contact details, and then you can contact him after the event. Um, Up next, we will have our question and answer session, and Amina Abrahams will be leading that. Thank you, everyone, and I hand over to Amina.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. So if everyone can just address who they would like to ask the question to, and then just put the question next to it. Then Tahseen will collect the questions and we'll read them on a first come, first serve basis. If you're comfortable with the chat box, if you're not and you'd like to raise your hand, you can. Okay, I'm just going to go ahead. Pieter, there's a lot of questions for you.
I see
Okay,
that.
yeah. So the first one here is a question for Pieter. In your experience with your interview, what type of questions can the candidates expect from the civil field?
Okay, so during your interview, you present a presentation, a 15 minutes presentation. You will usually ask you questions on that, or they will develop questions. To give an example, if you, so to just in the civil field, I can just basically maybe name a few questions, what type of questions can expect. So I'm more into geometric design and a bit of pavement design and stuff like that. So they will basically ask, or one of, if I can just name a few questions they have asked me in the technical field. One of the questions they asked me is, please explain the difference between a rigid pavement and a flexible pavement by using or drawing a sketch of a load distribution diagram. And I can ask you questions like, what is a K value? What define a K value for me? Or what is the most important element in geometric design? And if you don't know its design speed, you won't get registered. So you know the basic principles you should know. And the same in terms of health and safety, they will ask smart questions like, who's responsible for safety on a site? And the correct answer will be everybody. And they can ask you ethical questions. I can actually name a dozen, but what I want to actually add to is that the questions will come from your presentations and then developed into direct actually questions. So if you illustrate, for example, where you did a say, for example, a bow mouth design, and then they will ask you, listen, did you consider drainage, and how did you design the drainage? And then they will ask direct technical questions. So that's just, I can name like 100 questions, but that's a few for just to give you a few examples. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so for Google, does postgraduate study count as experience towards ECSA?
So I did my postgraduate after or during the whole process of registration. So, and to add on that, it wasn't even engineering related. So for me, there was not that consideration, but I'm not sure, maybe for Stacey, because she completed her master's, with regard, well, after her undergrad, if it had any influence or they noted it as an experience. So maybe Stacey can add on that.
Stacey?
Yes, so I think it strongly adds towards your outcome 11, which is your continued professional development. I don't think that, to be honest, I'm not actually sure how strongly it carried in my, whether how much they considered it in giving me the or registering me, but it does count. It does carry some weight. It definitely carries weight towards the outcome 11, if not anything else.
Okay, thank you. Then I noticed that people are asking multiple questions in like a paragraph. So I'm just gonna ask one question and then the speaker can answer, and then I'll ask another one and then the speaker can answer. I think that'll work out the best. So this one is for Stacy. Does the ECSA journey only start post qualification? Does experience gained during in-service training and vacation work count?
So to be honest, I'm not really sure, but I do think you need to have at least 3 years of post-qualification experience before you can even consider registering. So it does add value to your overall experience, but I think ECSA will be more interested in what you've done once you've become qualified, rather than your training while you were studying. Yeah, I hope that answers the question.
Thank you. And then there's another one for Stacy. It says, who is eligible to be a mentor? Can you have a PR technologist as your mentor towards PR engineer registration?
I actually don't know the answer to that. I don't know if one of my other speakers perhaps are more familiar. As I said, I didn't get registered having a mentor, so I really can't say. But I will say that one of my supervisors was a PR tech, and it was considered as part of my registration. He did write a referee report for me, so I do think that they would consider it, yes.
Okay, thank
Also,
you.
I can also confirm that
Okay,
that Stacey just said.
okay, thank you, Pieter. And then another one for Stacy, is it necessary to get registered in the first place? I know of some structural engineers who say they will never register as they do not need it for their careers. Can you comment on that?
Uh, well, I would say as a structural engineer, you would definitely need it. So I think it is necessary to get registered. It's not only, it shows that you're competent of doing your job, first of all, but it also gives the public confidence in your work. So by not becoming registered, are you giving the public confidence in your work? That's ultimately what it comes down to. So, and it also makes you more marketable, or the firm you're working for more marketable, if they've got more registered engineers. So I would recommend getting registered, yes.
Okay, thank you. A question for Pieter. Of the 3 minimum years of experience required post-qualification, is there a specific balance of on-site experience and design exposure that is required? If not, what would your recommended be in terms of time that could be allocated to each aspect before submitting an application for PRNG?
Okay, so that's kind of a tough question because I don't know the exact answer, but I can give you a few examples. So I know of a colleague of mine that went for the professional review interview and they said, sorry, you can't get registered because you don't have any site experience, go home. So then I know of people that was never set a foot on site and they got registered. So it's a very difficult question to ask, but if I can give a recommendation, I would say after your 3 years experience, I would say would recommend at least 3 months of site experience. And if you are based, for example, in a design office, and you go to site to do survey measurements or whatever for a week or two, you should actually highlight that experience because that is still site experience. Yes, I hope
Thank
that gives some clarity.
Okay, thank you, Pieter. There's another one here for you. Is PR Tech the dead end for technology route undergraduates? Can you at some point register as a PR Eng with a BTech or an advanced diploma, a BEng Tech, or maximize number of years of experience and postgrad qualifications, for example, MEng or PhD?
Okay, so I know the BTech fault, the University of Technology, there's no such thing as the BTech degree anymore. They have I think an advanced diploma, they call it now, a diploma, an advanced diploma. So I think, I'm not sure about, but as far as I'm aware, if you have the advanced diploma of the honors, you can still register as a professional technologist. I'm not 100% certain, but I think that is the case currently. So, but I don't believe there's any graduates that has 3 years post experience with that new advanced diploma. Maybe ECSA will have a different type of registration. I'm not 100% sure. Maybe somebody else in the audience knows. In terms of registration, can you get at some point in the register? Okay, yeah. So to register as a professional engineer, if you follow the technical route, I know if you have a MEng degree, so that you can obtain after your BTech degree, or if you did a BSc honors like me, you can do a MEng degree, and you have 15 years post experience, you are eligible to apply to register as a professional engineer. That's the latest that I've heard of somebody who's on the ECSA panel. So if you have 15 years experience postgraduate and you have a MEng degree, yeah, you can apply for PR Eng.
Okay, there's another question for you,
Oh,
Pieter. It says if you start with your PR mentorship and you get your BTech or equivalent qualification before you register as a PR Tech, do you have to register as a PR Tech first, or can you discontinue and move towards PR Tech registration?
yes. If you have a BTech, you don't have to register as a PR technician first before you advance to basically a PR tech. So some people do that, but if you have a BTech degree, I would go straight for the PR tech registration, or that will be my suggestion. But I know of a lot of candidates that register first as a PR technician because they have enough experience post their national diploma, and then afterwards registered as a PR tech after of 3 years, because you have to obtain that rule doesn't change. You still have to gain 3 years post qualification experience after your BTech before you can apply for PR technologist.
Thank you, Pieter. And then there's a question for Google. How did your postgrad business administration degree change the course of your engineering?
So even after I obtained my postgrad in that business administration course, I still was doing design work in my career. So I think it just helped in terms of just understanding other elements of the build of the business. So for instance, some of the modules that I covered were some um, legal courses like business law. Also did a bit of project management and also did finance management. So it just, as I'm getting exposure to that part of the business, it just helped me in terms of just being able to understand fundamentally, or even though it wasn't like advanced, but at least I can have a bit of input and a bit of understanding when I'm tasked to engage in such aspects of the business.
Okay, so we have some questions from Erik. So Erik asked these in light that the participants should be thinking about this. I'm not sure which of the speakers would like to answer any of them. So I think I'm just going to read them, and then whoever's comfortable to answer can answer.
Sorry about that. I think Amina is experiencing some technical difficulties. I'll just pick up where she left off. And this was relating to the questions that we had received from Erik, and this is posed to the panelists. Either one of the panelists can either raise their hand to answer the question. How can they YPFs? Just by the way, YPF stands for Young Professional Forums. Get more support from the various discipline-specific voluntary associations. Can any one of our speakers volunteer to answer that question? All right. I'll move on to the next one. The second question is, how can YPFs contribute to the value chain of the profession? All right. I'll move on to the next question, which is question number 3. What tool can be developed to make sure that all RSA 17 laws applicable to the profession, as well as the 346 regulations, be complied with? From the panel of CESA YPF, if either one of you have an answer to these questions, I would recommend that you jump in as well. You can raise your hand to answer some of these questions. Going to the fourth question, can there be created a considerable financial advantage to becoming an ECSA engineer? Say pay around 30% of annual fees if you are a voluntary association member and qualified ECSA engineer. All right. I think that gives us something to think about, especially as young professionals. You know, the future of engineering is basically in our hands. And this gives us something to think about, and something that we can definitely explore further. Some of these questions we can definitely explore further, especially taking into consideration question number 2 on how to contribute to the value chain of the profession. I think it's within every professional engineer, especially once you get registered, to see what value you can bring to engineering as a whole, to the engineering profession as a whole. So I think some of these questions really give us something to think about, something to reflect on. And I think especially reflecting on your career as an engineer, because I don't think it stops merely at getting your professional registration and, moving on with your life. It's just about bringing value not only to the organization, but to the country. I mean, we're seeing so many engineers, especially once they get registered, moving to other countries. So I think some of these questions might really, cause us to reflect and maybe do better as engineers. All right. Now going to question number 5. How can the tension between humanistic, environmental, and ethics standpoint and the profit-driven developer standpoint be resolved? more humanities courses at varsity, maybe. I think maybe this is something that we can discuss further. If anyone has input on that question, maybe you can raise your hand and we can discuss it further.
Hi, Lorato. I don't have an answer to this question. They're very challenging questions, and I
Yes,
would
they
highly
are.
recommend participants to think about them after this meeting. But I would like to encourage anyone who would like to chat to Erik further to contact him. I put his email address in the chat, and he is happy for anybody to just send him an email and chat about these questions, or if there are any other questions that you may have. So yeah, thank you. And I'll hand back to Amina. I think all of us in the Century City area are back online.
Hi, I'm back. Um, so I think the questions, I agree with Lorato on, I think the questions that Erik posed was very deep and a lot more theoretical. And I think it's way too advanced for all of us. So that requires maybe, I don't know, 20 years experience. So we're going to go back to the ones that are very relevant to us currently. But the ones that Erik posed are important to think about. So we have a question for Google. What can I benefit from registering with ECSA?
I think it's just to add on what Stacey had mentioned earlier, it's just to give people the confidence that you are actually been certified by a council, that you are competent to be recognized as a professional engineer. So it was basically what Stacey was was talking about, and then it's just really, yeah, the recognition, and also associated with the recognition, not just yourself, but towards your organization, but also when you are delivering to a client. I feel they would be more confident if you say, oh, as part of our team, we actually do have professional individuals working on your project or delivering on that projects that you are appointed to do.
And then there's another one for Google. Okay, so the question reads, does the candidate apply for both their experience appraisal and their professional review interview? And if yes, at what stage do they know they must apply?
Okay. So the interviews, it's not something that you apply as a standalone. It's part of the whole registration process. So as the previous speakers that were speaking before me said that, well, you go through, once you have, you 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 think you've qualified, and also your mentor think you've qualified and have reached competency against all 11 outcomes, you then go through the whole process of writing your different reports and submitting. So once you've done that submission, it's just a process from there to from where they actually evaluate the content of your report. And then towards the end of that registration process, then that's when you get to the interview part as the final step to just qualify whether you can register as a professional, or well, firstly, whether you have to go through the experience appraisal interview stage before getting to the professional review interview, or you can just go straight to the professional review interview. So it's not something that you apply for differently. It's just part of that whole registration process, but more towards the end of the evaluation process, I guess.
Okay. Thank you, Google. And then there's one that hasn't been addressed specifically to anyone. So any of the speakers are welcome to answer. And the question reads, do you have to remember all fine technical details of the projects that you have used on your engineering report?
I'll jump in and try and answer this one. I think to say you need to remember everything is not really possible, but you'll find that if it's something that you did and were involved in, remember, they're not interested in the entire project. They're interested in what you did on the project. So as long as you can confidently talk about the technical details of what you were involved in. They don't care that you're another member of the team did this technical part of the project. They're interested in what you did. So as long as you can defend and you can remember what you did and explain what you did, there's no reason to remember the entire technical portions of the project.
Thank you, Stacey. And then this question was skipped. This is actually my question. I accidentally skipped my own question. This is for Pieter. What is the main difference between degree of responsibility C, which is participating, and D, contributing, and E, performing? What's the main difference between those three?
I think that question should be directed to Stacey because that's her part. Maybe she can just assist me on that. But I would say that I can definitely say the E one is like where you're performing, or actually you have limited guidance. So you can actually, when a task is given to you, you can actually, without you have limited supervision. You can perform a task without asking 100 questions, or you can basically drive a project and complete a design, if I can put it that way. So I can answer, that's definitely a level E. I don't know, Stacey, can you contribute to this question?
Yes, so I think the differences are, as Pieter said, it's how on level E you're contributing fully, you're driving the project. On level C, you start to take responsibility for your work. So you also start contributing, but you're more getting guidance. You're still asking 100 questions, for example, but you're starting to take responsibility. Level D, you're now giving ideas on how to solve the problem, but you're discussing those ideas with your mentor. You're taking responsibility for your work, but you're also taking responsibility for the quality. So you're putting forward what you think is the best solution. And then on level E, you just run with the project. You decide, okay, this is the solution I'm going to follow, and you don't discuss it with your supervisor. And I think those are the key differences. And as I mentioned, you might find in your experience, as you're going through the motions, you will often overlap on the different degrees of responsibility. Hope that answers the question.
Thank you, Stacey. I see there are answers coming into Erik's questions. I do want to encourage any of the participants that are present to give it a shot and give an answer in the chat. It just makes us all think about these things. And some of them are quite advanced, I do admit, but then there's some that are things that you might feel necessary to input on. So do give it a go. Your answer might be unique, and it might be something that Erik maybe overlooked. Okay. And then the next question is a question to all speakers. And it asks, I heard colleagues talking about how stressful the interviews are. In your respective experiences, how stressful is it? So maybe each of the speakers can go through their experience and then just talk about your stresses and your nerves. And we'll start with Stacey and then Pieter and then Gugu.
Okay. It was quite a stressful experience. You don't know what to expect. But once so beforehand, I was quite stressed and quite nervous. I would recommend making sure you're prepared, your presentation is ready, you know what's in your presentation and your reports and TRs, and also that you know all the legislation available. So for example, civil engineers, you need to know construction regulations and how they're important for you. So those sort of things just help you, so be prepared. The interview itself was actually, or my experience, the panel of interviewers were very relaxed. They like, you've got to look at it as if you're talking to your colleagues. You're explaining your work to your colleagues. And I mean, it didn't really help my nerves when they said that, I will admit. But yeah, they didn't grill me on the questions because I was prepared. So the actual experience for me was not too stressful. Don't know who wants to jump in. Okay, Pieter?
So yeah, so if I can elaborate on my experience, to add on to Stacey, yeah, before the time you you are quite stressed because it's a big thing. And they actually called me an hour before the time and said, can you come 2 hours earlier? Because they had, but anyway, that's not the important thing. Is what actually, if I can just give a hint, is that remember that what put me at ease, I would say, is that they can't ask you questions outside your application. Or they can actually, but then you should answer, listen, that's outside my field of competence and you can't answer that. But they can't. So what's in your report, they can only answer or ask you questions with regarding to that. So that put me a little bit actually on ease. So that makes it a bit less stressful. So, but yeah, that's how basically how it went.
Pieter, sorry, I just want to add to your point. So on the technical side of things, they'll only ask questions in your report. So for me, I focused on structure, so they're not going to ask me
Yes.
technical questions about a road, but they
Yes.
will ask you on, I want to say, the softer issues, like the different contracts. So if you haven't touched on the contracts in your report, they will still ask you about that. So at least have an understanding of those sort of things is my point.
Yes. Yes. Definitely, I agree with that.
I think it goes the same like what Stacey's saying in terms of the contract. So even with the technical, so for instance, for myself, my complex problem was a stormwater management problem, and I had specifically spoken about the rational method and modified rational method, but they still expected me to know other methods or be aware rather of other methods which I can use should I not be able to use that particular one. So for me, the technical part was very technical. I think it just depends on the 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 reviews that you have and their speciality. I think one of the guys on my panel was a stormwater specialist, so it got very technical for the first part of the interview. But then the second part with the other interviewers, it was really questioning on the content of my report and me just elaborating and then just making sure that I didn't just copy and paste some of the content in my report. And actually, I am aware of the different, say, for instance, the different contracts and the different regulations that are applicable and consideration in terms of local and national authorities. So it wasn't, yeah, the second part wasn't as stressful because it was related to my submission.
Thank you. And then the last question, it seems, is directed to Stacey. Stacey, in terms of your experience with your interview, what type of questions can we expect from the structural field?
Okay, so I think I kind of touched on it a bit. You need to understand contracts. They did ask me quite a few questions about that. You need to know NEMA, Occupational Health and Safety Act, construction regulation. So those are just specifically as a structural engineer, I think they focus on the construction regulations and your responsibility as stipulated in those regulations. And then other questions they asked a little bit. I didn't get a lot of technical questions, but I think it's because I'm not sure there was a structural engineer in my review. But I think it's important that you use the presentation to highlight how you achieved all 11 outcomes. So yeah, there weren't really many technical questions from my side or that I got asked. My colleague got asked, what is the expiry of cement? So they can throw in curveballs like that, just so you're aware. Yeah, I hope that helps.
I think, can I just add on what Stacey's saying about just making sure that in your presentation you highlight all the outcomes. So I think the more information or relevant information you speak about in the presentation, it actually then just sort of limits the amount of questions that they can ask you or like the more in-depth questions. So if you speak about that, then once they question you, it's not really specifically probing on the outcomes. It can be even general questions that they're just asking to get further information or create a conversation.
Yeah, and just adding to that, Gugu, I mean, they will potentially ask you questions, but it's more, as Gugu says, like conversational and interest in your project. So, and those questions should be reasonably easy because it's a project you've completed and worked on for a while. So, yeah, not all of the questions are technical questions.
Thank you, Stacey and Google. There's more questions that came in. Stacey, in areas where the degree of responsibility does overlap, like you mentioned, between D and E, for example, over a long period of time, how would you recommend structuring the TERs in such a case?
So the TERs are quite challenging in you've got limited words that you can use. So I selected projects. The nature of work I was involved in is I was changing projects very frequently. So I had to try and cover my experience in a lot of projects in limited words. I don't think there's a specific way to structure your TERs to benefit this. It's just in the column on the right highlighting that this was a degree of responsibility D or this was a degree of responsibility E. I don't think there's a right way to structure your TERs in this regard. It's just highlighting the differences, and it's almost your wording is important in how this project was a degree of responsibility E, but this one was a degree of responsibility D. I think that's where you potentially can take on, adding clarity to those different degrees of responsibility.
Thank you, Stacey. And then there's a general question again for any of the speakers, or actually all the speakers. The question reads, in terms of the scope of a contract, going outside the scope, can it contribute to a TER or contribute to the report?
John, will you just explain that question, or I don't know, does somebody else get what you're saying there?
Sean, can you?
Sorry, man, it's maybe a bit vague, but say your contract is set up for routine road maintenance and you're going outside of your routine duties in terms of how the contract is set up. Say you develop a new problem that is not routine road maintenance based. That's obviously a good indication for you because it's outside of your scope. Can we use that as a TER, or how you structure that in terms of a variation on the contract? Because it's basically a bit more complex than what was originally put in the contract. I'm talking a bit wide now, but I don't know if that's maybe came through.
John, yes, I would, if I can say, I would say yes, you can. I hope I understand your question correct. If you say basically you worked on a routine road maintenance contract, but then something different happens, that's more a more other type of problem, say for example a pavement design problem or something totally different. I would say yes, you can include that in your TER. I don't see a problem with that.
It's just in general, if people get stuck in one field, you must find ways and means to get registered at the end of the day, in terms of a design, or that's just maybe the question that I'm or the answer that I'm leading to is
okay.
Yeah, that's maybe just because if you don't have another choice in terms of a job, you stuck at one place. Maybe find ways and means that can contribute to your registration in terms of your scope of your contract.
Yes, I understand. So to give you an example, one of my colleagues there, he was never in the design office. He was always out on site, basically doing ARE jobs, assistant resident engineer jobs on road construction projects. So he got registered by asking the design office or to do some small designs on sites where, in terms of, like, for example, a variation order comes on site, and he says to them, listen, give me that design, or something like that. So that's definitely, possible. Or changing a seal design, and then they do the seal design basically during the on-site with the SMT.
Okay, thank you, Peter. If there's any last questions, you can raise your hand now.
Thank you, Amina. Just going back on some of the questions that Erik asked, we do have a few answers that have been placed in the chat. Answers to those questions. The answer to question 6, which was received from Martina, just to reiterate question 6, it read, how can the accounting profession be swayed to factor in environmental costings? Environmental aspects do cost more than costs for straight engineering. Martina's view is that she thinks that there should be government incentives. Example, exemptions, incentives, exemptions to encourage environmental engineering. Then the answer to question number 5, reiterating question number 5, how can the tension between humanistic, environmental, and ethics standpoint and the profit-driven developer standpoint be resolved? More humanities courses at varsity. And the possible answer would be more courses on environmental engineering, environmental materials, and alternatives. So that wraps up the question and answer session. For conclusions, I'd like to hand over to Christian. Thank you, everyone.
All right. Thank you, Lerato. We're still in load shedding, but we power on. Thank you so much to our speakers, Stacy, Pieter, Gugu, and Erik, for your insightful presentations. I think that was quite an interactive, session with a lot of deep questions. And I think we will reflect further on, you know. So yeah, with regard to CESA, we have some upcoming event, and the next one will be the career development webinar. So watch out for an email, from your CESA YP representative. And I think after such a presentation, you're probably thinking, how can I join, the CESA YPF? And I think if you want to join, you can send us an email at CESAWCYPF at gmail.com. And yeah, thank you so much for your participation. And also thank you to our sponsors. Next slide. I think these are our annual sponsors. So thank you to all of them. And on that note, have a good evening and see you next time. Cheers.
Thank you.